I need to say this up front because I know how it sounds. I've read enough forums, enough threads where people post things like this and get torn apart in the comments. Guy sees a light, guy can't explain the light. Guy writes 10,000 words about how the light changed his life. I get it. I'm not here to convince anyone. I'm here because my therapist told me to write it down, and because I promised Dr. Kessler I would, and because honestly, I think if I don't put this somewhere outside my own head, I'm going to lose the ability to distinguish it from everything else I think about during the day. It's been 14 months. The light is still on. I want to talk about what happened before I stopped being the kind of person who could talk about it. My name is June Morrow. I'm 39. I have a degree in marine biology from the University of Rhode Island that I have never once used for its intended purpose. For 11 years, I worked as an environmental compliance officer for the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, which is a title that sounds more important than it is. What it means, practically, is that I drove to places where things had gone wrong, spills, contamination events, zoning violations near protected waterways, and I wrote reports confirming that, yes, things had gone wrong, and then those reports entered a system that either did or did not result in anyone doing anything about it. I was good at the job, not because I was brilliant, but because I was thorough, and because I could be in an uncomfortable place for a long time without needing to leave. That second quality is the one that matters. In March of last year, I was reassigned. Budget cuts had eliminated two positions in the Coastal Monitoring Division, and because I had seniority, but not the kind of seniority that comes with political protection, I was moved laterally into what my supervisor, Greg Fialho, called a temporary infrastructure audit role. What this meant was that the state had received federal money to catalog and assess the structural condition of decommissioned maritime navigation aids along the Massachusetts coast. Lighthouses mostly, but also daymarks, fog signal stations, and a handful of skeletal towers on islands that no longer had regular ferry access. There were 47 sites on the list. Most of them were well-documented tourist attractions, historical society properties, things with gift shops and weekend volunteer docents. Those were easy. You drove there. You confirmed the roof wasn't caving in. You photographed the foundation. You checked whether the electrical service had been formally disconnected or was just dormant, and you filed the paperwork. I could do 3 of those in a day. The harder ones were the ones nobody had visited in a while. The skeletal towers on Bird Island and Pinnakees, the remains of the fog signal station on Cuttyhunk, and a handful of mainland lights that had been decommissioned in the 70s or 80s and had since been transferred to municipalities that didn't have the budget to maintain them and didn't have the political will to demolish them. Barton Point Light was one of those. I need to describe the place carefully because the physical reality of it matters. Barton Point is not a real tourist destination. It's a stub of rocky land jutting into Buzzards Bay about 9 miles south of New Bedford, accessible by a single-lane road that branches off Route 6 and dead ends in a gravel turnout that can hold maybe 4 cars. There's no signage, no historical marker. The land around the lighthouse was owned by the town of Westport until 2001, when it was transferred to a nonprofit land trust that went defunct in 2009, after which ownership reverted to the state by default. Nobody wanted it. It's not scenic enough to be a park and not dangerous enough to be a priority. The lighthouse itself is a 31-foot conical brick tower with an attached keeper's house built in 1891. The light was automated in 1954, decommissioned entirely in 1979, and the electrical service was disconnected in 1982, according to the last available utility record. The keeper's house had been boarded up at some point in the late 80s. The tower's door was padlocked, though the padlock was so corroded when I first arrived that it essentially crumbled when I put the bolt cutters to it. I went to Barton Point on April 11th. It was a Tuesday. Overcast, mid-40s. Wind coming off the bay, hard enough that I could feel the car rocking when I parked. I remember being annoyed because it was the last site on my list for the day, and I'd already done 2 assessments that morning, and I wanted to get home in time to call my daughter before her bedtime. Sophie lives with my ex-husband in Cranston. I get her every other weekend. I am very careful about the phone calls because they are the scaffolding of a relationship I'm trying not to let collapse entirely, and missing one feels like missing a rung on a ladder I'm already struggling to climb. I walk down the path to the point. The keeper's house was in worse shape than I'd expected. Roof partially collapsed on the north side, plywood over the windows, mostly intact, but warped and pulling away from the frames. There was trash inside. I could see it through the gaps. Beer cans, a sleeping bag, a milk crate. Someone had been using it, though not recently. The smell was old. The tower itself was in better condition structurally, which isn't unusual. Those old brick towers were built to outlast everything around them. I went inside. The ground floor was damp but sound. The iron staircase spiraled up to the lantern room, and I climbed it because that's what the checklist required. The stairs were rusted but solid. 31 feet isn't very high, but in a tower that narrow, with the wind audible through the walls, it feels like more. The lantern room was empty. The Fresnel lens had been removed decades ago, probably sold or transferred to a museum, which was common practice. The glazing was intact on 3 sides, cracked on the 4th. There was no lamp, no electrical fixture of any kind, just the iron platform where the lens assembly had sat, and the bare circular room with its windows looking out over the basin. I took my photographs. I filled out the structural assessment form. I noted the missing lens, the corroded hardware, the condition of the glazing. I made a recommendation for stabilization of the keeper's house roof to prevent further collapse. All routine. I was back in my car by 3:40, and I made it home in time to call Sophie and hear about her math test. That should have been the end of it. 3 weeks later, on May 2nd, I received an email from a woman named Patrice Gouveia, who worked for the Westport Town Clerk's office. She'd been CE'd on my assessment report. As a courtesy, the town still technically handled local permitting for the parcel, even though it was state-owned. And she wanted to flag something she called an ongoing constituent concern. She asked if I could call her. I did. Patrice was in her 60s, had worked for the town for over 20 years, and had that particular tone of voice, patient, slightly tired, preemptively apologetic, that people develop when they've spent a long time being the person others bring problems to that they know can't be solved. The light, she said. People call about it. What light? The lighthouse. Barton Point. People call and say the light is on. I waited for more context, and when it didn't come, I said, the light was decommissioned in 1979. The lens was removed. There's no electrical service. I know, she said. I know all that, but people call. They've been calling for, I'd have to check, at least since I started here. Used to be once or twice a year. Now it's more like once a month. Someone driving on Route 6, or one of the fishermen coming in late, and they see a light at Barton Point, and they call the town. And I tell them what you just told me, and that's usually the end of it. Have you been out there to check? I've driven down twice, both times during the day. Both times it looked the same, closed up, dark, no sign of anyone. I put it in the nuisance file and moved on. But since you're doing the assessment anyway, I thought you should know. In case it's relevant to your report. I told her I'd make a note of it. And I did, in the most bureaucratic way possible. Local reports of intermittent light activity at the site. Recommend confirmation of electrical disconnection and inspection for unauthorized occupancy. I assumed it was one of 3 things: kids with flashlights, some kind of optical reflection off the remaining glazing, or the kind of low-grade local legend that accrues around any abandoned structure near a waterway. Every coastal town has a version of this. The lighthouse that still shines. The foghorn that still sounds. It's folklore compressed into a maintenance complaint. I drove back to Barton Point on May 9th. This time, I brought a voltage tester, which I probably should have brought the first time. I checked every inch of the tower. There was no electrical service. Not dormant, not disconnected absent. The conduit that had once run from the utility pole on the access road to the keeper's house had been physically removed at some point. There was no wire, there was no junction box, there was no panel. I checked the keeper's house too, cutting away the plywood over the back door to get inside. Same story. Everything had been stripped, not vandalized, removed. Cleanly, professionally, probably by the utility company when they closed the account. I went up to the lantern room again. Empty. No lamp, no socket, no reflector. Just brick and iron and glass and the sound of wind. I stood there for a while, looking out at the bay. It was late afternoon, overcast again. The water was the color of pewter. I could see the running lights of a fishing boat heading south toward Cuttyhunk, and beyond that, nothing. I filed my supplemental report. I noted the absence of any electrical infrastructure and recommended no further action regarding the light reports, attributing them to probable reflection or misidentification. Greg Fialho signed off on it. That should have been the second end of it. But I kept thinking about it. Not obsessively, I want to be clear about that. I wasn't losing sleep. I wasn't driving back. I was thinking about it the way you think about a crossword clue. You couldn't get a low-level irritant that surfaces during idle moments. The thing that bothered me wasn't the reports themselves. It was the duration. Patrice had said people had been calling since at least the early 2000s, and she'd implied it went back further. 20 years of intermittent reports about a light in a tower with no power. If it were kids, they'd have moved on. If it were reflection, someone would have identified the source. 20 years is a long time for a nuisance that nobody can explain and nobody wants to investigate. On June 14th, I drove to Barton Point at night. I'm going to describe this part carefully. I left my apartment in Fall River at 9:15 p.m. It was a Wednesday. Full dark by that point. No moon, heavy cloud cover. I took Route 6 south and turned onto the access road at 9:48. I know the exact time because I looked at the dashboard clock, which was something I'd started doing habitually after my divorce marking time, noting transitions, keeping myself anchored to the factual structure of the day. Dr. Kessler says this is a control behavior. She's probably right. The access road was dark. No streetlights, no houses within direct line of sight. My headlights caught the gravel turnout, and I pulled in and parked facing the water. From the car, I could see the silhouette of the tower against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. The keeper's house was a low shape beside it. The light was on. I need to describe what I mean by that because it wasn't what I expected. I'd been imagining, to the extent I'd imagined anything, a flashlight beam, or maybe a lantern hanging in the lantern room, something explicable, a human act of illumination that I could attribute to trespass and close the file. This was not that. The lantern room was glowing. Not flashing, not rotating, not sweeping the bay the way an active navigation light would. Just glowing. A steady, warm, amber-white light that filled the glazed enclosure at the top of the tower and spilled out through the windows evenly in all directions. It was not bright enough to cast visible beams into the sky. It was not dim enough to be mistaken for reflection. It was exactly the luminosity of a light that was meant to be seen from the water, not a searchlight, not a beacon, but a marker, a thing that said, "Here, I am here." I sat in the car for a long time. I'm not sure how long. The clock said 10:11 when I finally opened the door, so at least 20 minutes. During that time, I did not see the light change in any way. It did not flicker. It did not brighten or dim. It did not move. It was simply on. The wind was still strong. I could hear the water on the rocks below the point. I walked down the path with my flashlight, and the flashlight felt absurd because there was already light. The lighthouse was doing what it was designed to do, which was illuminate the approach. I reached the tower door. It was still unlocked from my previous visit. I'd replaced the destroyed padlock with a new one from my assessment kit, and the key was on my work ring. I unlocked it. The ground floor was dark. My flashlight beam moved over damp brick, the iron staircase, the usual debris. Nothing different. No generator, no battery, no cable running up the wall. Nothing. I climbed the stairs. I want to be precise about what happened on the stairs because it's the part I've gone over most often, and the part I'm least certain about. The staircase is a tight spiral, maybe 4 feet in diameter, and it makes 7 full rotations between the ground floor and the lantern room. The treads are perforated iron, so you can see below you and above you simultaneously, which creates a vertiginous layered effect even in daylight. In the dark, with only my flashlight, the visual field was chaotic, my beam hitting the central column, the curving wall, my own shadow multiplied and rotating with each step. As I climbed, the quality of the air changed. I don't mean temperature, though it did get slightly warmer. I mean the texture. The ground floor air had been damp, briny, cold as standard for a maritime structure in June. By the third rotation of the stairs, the air felt thicker. Not humid exactly. Dense, as though there were more of it per breath than there should have been. I was breathing normally, but each breath felt more substantial, like the difference between drinking water and drinking milk. Something in the air had weight. By the fifth rotation, I could see light above me. Not my flashlight, the light. It was coming through the hatchway at the top of the stairs, and it was steady and warm, and it was the color of early afternoon in early autumn. That's the only way I can describe it. It wasn't white, it wasn't yellow. It was the color of light, filtered through turning leaves, that specific amber that makes everything it touches look like a memory. I stopped climbing. I stood on the stairs for what felt like 5 minutes, but was probably less. My flashlight was still on, pointing upward, but its beam was invisible against the stronger light from above. I could hear the wind outside, and the water below, and my own breathing, and nothing else. No hum, no buzz, no mechanical sound of any kind. Whatever was producing that light was doing it silently. I climbed the rest of the way. The lantern room was full of light. I mean that literally, not illuminated by a source full. The light was in the room the way water is in a glass. It had no point of origin. It was not coming from above or below or from any fixture. It existed in the volume of the space itself, filling the circular room from the iron floor platform to the peak of the roof, pressing gently against the glazing on all sides. The windows were glowing outward because the light was pushing against them the way water pushes against the walls of a container. The room was warm, not hot warm the way a room is warm when someone has been living in it. The kind of warmth that accumulates from presence, from breath, and body heat, and hours of occupation. It felt inhabited. That's the word that came to me then, and it's the word I keep coming back to. The lantern room felt inhabited the way a home feels inhabited when you walk in and you know someone is there even before you see them or hear them. Some quality in the air that says, this space is in use. Someone is using this. I stood in it. The light was on my skin, on my hands, on my clothes. It didn't cast shadows. I moved my hand and there was no shadow on the wall behind it. My hand simply had light on all sides of it equally, as though the photons were arriving from every direction simultaneously. I turned off my flashlight. It made no difference. The room was exactly as bright with my flashlight off as it was with it on. I stayed for 11 minutes. I know, because when I came back down to the car, the clock said 10:38, and my best reconstruction of the timeline puts my arrival at the lantern room at approximately 10:27. During those 11 minutes, nothing happened. I need to say that again because it's important. Nothing happened. The light did not change. No sound occurred. No figure appeared. Nothing touched me. Nothing spoke. I was alone, in a small round room full of sourceless light. And the only thing that was wrong was the light itself. In the warmth, in the sense of habitation, in the thing I haven't mentioned yet, which is this. I didn't want to leave. Not in the way you don't want to leave a party, or a warm bed, or a good movie. In the way you don't want to leave a room where someone you haven't seen in years is about to walk through the door. Anticipatory, that's the quality. The room felt like it was waiting for something, and I felt like I was waiting with it. And the waiting was not anxious, but patient, and the patience felt good. I felt, and I'm choosing this word carefully, I felt welcome. I left because I had training that told me to leave. 11 years of environmental compliance work teaches you a specific discipline. When something doesn't match your model, you document it and you withdraw. You don't interpret. You don't linger. You note the discrepancy and you go back to the office and you file the report and you let someone with more authority decide what it means. I didn't have the authority to decide what the light meant, so I left. The stairs going down were dark. My flashlight worked normally. The ground floor was cold and damp and smelled like salt. When I stepped outside, the tower behind me was dark. I turned around and looked up, and the lantern room was black. No glow, no warmth, no light of any kind. As though it had never been on, I stood there in the wind, in the dark, for a while, and then I drove home. I did not file a report. I need to explain why, because it's the first decision I made that I can't fully justify to myself. I am a compliance officer. My entire professional function is documentation. I had witnessed an unexplained phenomenon at a state-owned property that I was specifically assigned to assess, and the only correct action was to file a detailed report, flag it for follow-up, and recommend a formal investigation. I didn't do it because I couldn't figure out what form to use. That's the honest reason. That's how bureaucratic my thinking was. There's a form for structural deficiency, and a form for environmental contamination, and a form for unauthorized occupancy, and a form for electrical hazard. There's no form for the decommissioned lighthouse was full of impossible light, and the light felt like it was waiting for me. I couldn't categorize the observation, so I couldn't file it. And because I couldn't file it, it didn't become official. And because it didn't become official, it remained mine. I think about that a lot. I went back 4 days later. June 18th, a Sunday night. Same routine, drove down after dark, parked in the turnout, looked up, the light was on. Same steady warm glow, same amber tone. I climbed the tower, same thick air on the stairs, same warmth in the lantern room, same sourceless illumination filling the space like a liquid, same absence of shadow, same feeling of habitation, of anticipatory welcome. This time, I brought instruments. A voltage tester, nothing. An EMF meter I'd borrowed from the office. It registered elevated readings throughout the lantern room, but not dramatically so. Consistent with a strong magnetic field, but not consistent with any electrical source. A thermometer, the lantern room was 71 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground floor was 54, the outside air was 58. A camera, the photographs came out overexposed to the point of being nearly white, though I could still make out the edges of the windows and the iron platform. The light, in the photographs, appeared to be everywhere. There was no visible source and no visible structure to the illumination. It was just there. I stayed 22 minutes that time. On the drive home, I realized I was already planning my next visit. Over the following 7 weeks, I went to Barton Point 12 more times, always at night, always alone. I didn't tell anyone. Not Greg, not Patrice, not Dr. Kessler, not my sister in Vermont, who I talk to every Sunday. I told no one. The visits became part of my routine, embedded in the structure of my week. The way grocery shopping and laundry and phone calls to Sophie were embedded, not special, not urgent, just something I did. Each visit was almost identical. I drove down. The light was on. I climbed the tower. The lantern room was warm and full and waiting. I stood in it. Nothing happened. I left. The light went dark. I want to emphasize that nothing happened. This is not a story about something dramatic occurring in the lantern room. This is a story about standing in a room full of impossible light, night after night, and slowly becoming someone who needed to be there. The changes were in me, not the room. By the third visit, I'd stopped bringing instruments. They didn't tell me anything useful, and the act of holding a meter or pointing a camera felt wrong, not morally wrong, but tonally wrong, like bringing a clipboard to a funeral. The room was not a sight. It was not a phenomenon to be measured. I recognized this with the part of my brain that still functioned analytically. It was becoming a relationship. I was going to see the light the way you go to see someone. The light was there, and I was there, and we were in the room together, and the room was warm, and the waiting was patient, and the patience felt like being known. By the fifth visit, I noticed I was dressing differently. Not consciously, I didn't decide to wear better clothes to the lighthouse, but I'd look down at myself in the car and realize I'd put on a nicer shirt, or that I'd brushed my hair more carefully than usual, or that I was wearing the earrings Sophie had given me for my birthday. Small things, the kind of things you do when you're going somewhere that matters. By the eighth visit, I started talking, not to anyone, to the room, to the light. I sat on the iron platform in the middle of the lantern room, and I talked the way you talk when you're alone and don't expect to be heard, about my day, about the weather, about the assessment I'd done that morning at a perfectly functional day mark in Dartmouth that had been boring and normal and somehow infuriating in its normalcy, about Sophie, about how I'd missed a call from her the week before, and she'd sounded disappointed in the voicemail, and I'd listened to the voicemail 4 times and then deleted it because keeping it felt like keeping evidence of my own failure. I talked about my marriage, about how Dan had been patient for years and then suddenly wasn't, and how the sudden wasn't had felt like a relief, and how the relief had felt like proof that I was the kind of person who deserved to be left. About how the apartment in Fall River was fine, functional, clean, affordable, and how I hated it with a completeness that startled me, not because anything was wrong with it, but because nothing in it waited for me. I came home, and the apartment was exactly as I'd left it. The lights were off. The air was the temperature of absence. Nobody had been there. Nobody was going to be there. The apartment confirmed every evening that I was alone, and the confirmation was so consistent and so accurate that it had stopped feeling like information and started feeling like a condition. The lantern room was the opposite of my apartment. The lantern room was warm when I arrived. The light was on when I got there. Something had been there before me. Something was there with me, and the quality of the space was the quality of being expected. Not surprised, but expected. The way a room feels when someone has been waiting for you, specifically. When the warmth is for you, and the light is for you, and the patience is for you. I know what this sounds like. I know it sounds like I was lonely, and I projected meaning onto a physical anomaly. Dr. Kessler has said exactly this in her careful clinical language, and I've nodded and agreed because she's probably right, and because agreeing is easier than explaining. But I need to say what it felt like, even if what it felt like isn't what it was. It felt like being loved, not romantically, not parentally, not the way Sophie loves me, or the way Dan used to, or the way my sister does, from a safe distance. It felt like being loved the way a harbor loves a boat structurally, functionally. The light existed to hold something, and I was the thing it was holding, and the holding was not emotional, but architectural. I fit. The room had a shape, and I was the shape. The light was on because I was coming, and it would be on tomorrow because I would come tomorrow. And this mutual certainty, the lights and mine, was the closest thing to peace I had felt in years. I am aware that this is the part where I'm supposed to tell you about the turn. The moment the light changes, the moment something appears in the room, the moment I realize I've been lured, and the warmth was a trap, and the patience was predatory. I've read those stories. I know the structure. That isn't what happened. What happened is that I missed a phone call from Sophie. It was July 23rd, a Tuesday. I had planned to call her at 7:30, which was our usual time. At 6:45, I was already thinking about Barton Point. By 7, I was in the car. I didn't decide to skip the call. I just didn't make it. I drove to the lighthouse instead, and I was in the lantern room by 8:15, sitting on the iron platform in the warm, impossible light. And I didn't remember the call until I was driving home at 10:40 and saw my phone on the passenger seat and realized I had a voicemail. Sophie's voice, 7 years old. "Mom, it's me. Are you there? I wanted to tell you about swimming. I went off the diving board. The big one. Okay, call me back. Love you." I pulled over on Route 6 and sat in the car with the engine running and listened to it 3 times, and then I cried in a way that I hadn't cried since the divorce papers. Not from sadness, but from a sudden, disorienting recognition that something had shifted without my noticing. I had chosen the light over my daughter, not deliberately, not with malice, not even consciously. But I had done it. The light had been where I needed to be, and Sophie had been somewhere else, and I'd gone to the light. I called her back. It was too late. She was in bed. Dan answered and was polite about it in the way that felt worse than anger. "She waited up for a while," he said. "She's fine. She understands." "She doesn't understand," I thought. She's 7. She understands that I didn't call. That's what she understands. I didn't go back to Barton Point for 9 days. Those 9 days were bad. I don't mean dramatically bad. No crisis. No breakdown. No emergency. I mean, the texture of my daily life deteriorated in a way that was harder to name. The apartment felt worse, not different. I hadn't rearranged anything or changed anything, but worse. The quality of the air, the quality of the silence, the way the refrigerator hummed at a pitch that I could now hear from every room, the way the fluorescent light in the bathroom buzzed in a frequency that seemed to be slightly but not measurably different from the frequency it had buzzed at before, the way the evening light coming through the west-facing window was the wrong color, too blue, too thin, too much like what it was, which was just sunlight hitting a building across the street and bouncing in at an angle that had nothing to do with me. Everything was just what it was. That was the problem. My apartment was an apartment. The light was light. The air was air. Nothing in my ordinary environment had the quality of intention. Nothing was for me. And I'd never noticed this before, Barton Point. Or if I hadn't had language for it. And now I did. And the language made the absence visible, and the visibility made it unbearable. I called Sophie every night at 7:30. She told me about swimming, about her friend Ava's new dog, about a book she was reading about horses. She was fine. She was 7 and fine, and she didn't know that her mother was sitting in a dark apartment thinking about a lighthouse. On August 1st, I went back. The light was on. I climbed the tower. The air thickened on the 3rd rotation. The lantern room was warm. The light was everywhere. I sat on the iron platform, and I said, out loud, in a conversational tone, I can't keep doing this. Nothing answered. Nothing changed. The light continued. The warmth continued. I sat in it, and the warmth was on my skin, and the light was on all sides of me, and there was no shadow anywhere in the room. I missed a call from my daughter, I said. I missed it because I was here. The light did not respond. It was not the kind of thing that responded. It was just on. It was always just on. I need to understand what you are, I said. I need to know why you're here, or what you want, or what this is. I need something, some kind of answer, because I can't keep coming here if I don't know what I'm coming to. The light was warm. The room was warm. The waiting was patient. No answer came, because no answer was available, because the light was not a thing that answered. It was a thing that was on. That's all it had ever done. That's all it was doing now. I left after 40 minutes, the longest I'd stayed. On the stairs going down, in the dark, with my flashlight making its ordinary beam against the ordinary iron, I felt a grief so specific and so architectural that I could almost draw it. It had dimensions. It had walls. It was a room-shaped grief, and the room it was shaped like was the one I'd just left. I need to talk about Patrice now. In mid-August, I called her. I told her I'd been following up on the light reports as part of my assessment work, which was technically true, and I asked if she could provide any additional context names of people who'd called, dates, anything that might help me write a comprehensive report, which I had no intention of writing. Patrice was helpful. She pulled records going back to 2003, which was when the town had switched to a digital complaint system. Before that, she said, there were paper files, but they'd been moved to storage, and she wasn't sure where. Between 2003 and the present, there had been 61 reports of a light at Barton Point. I asked Patrice to email me the list, and she did. Each entry had a date, a time, a brief description, and the name of the caller. I spent an evening going through them. The descriptions were consistent. A steady, warm light in the lantern room, visible from the water or from Route 6 on clear nights. No flashing, no rotation, no color change. Every report described the same thing I'd seen. The callers were mostly fishermen and local residents, a few tourists, one Coast Guard crew that had been transiting the bay in 2011 and had filed a formal report that, as far as I could tell, had never been followed up on. But there were patterns in the list that Patrice hadn't mentioned, Maybe because she hadn't looked at the data this way, or maybe because the patterns only became visible when you laid all 61 entries out on a table chronologically. The frequency was increasing. In 2003 and 2004, there was one report each year. By 2010, it was 3 or 4. By 2018, it was 8. In the 12 months before my first visit, there had been 14 reports. The light was coming on more often, or more people were seeing it, or both. The other pattern was harder to pin down, and I'm not sure it's real, but when I mapped the callers' locations where they'd been, when they saw the light, the early reports were all from the water. Fishermen, boaters, people passing through the bay. The light, in the early years, was visible only from the seaside. The later reports included people on Route 6, on the access road. One person, in 2021, reported seeing it from their backyard in Westport, over a mile away. If the data was accurate, the light was not just becoming more frequent. It was becoming more visible. Its reach was expanding. The circle of who could see it was widening year by year, slowly, incrementally, the way a tide rises not in a rush, but in a continuous, patient, almost geological increase. I did not share this analysis with anyone. I put the spreadsheet on my laptop, and I closed it, and I went to Barton Point that night, and I stood in the lantern room, and I said, "You're getting brighter." The light was warm, the light was steady, the light was on. In September, something changed, and something was me. I stopped going to Barton Point at night and started going during the day. Not to see the light was never on during the day. I confirmed this across multiple daytime visits. I went to be in the tower, I went to climb the stairs and sit in the lantern room and look out at the bay through the cracked glazing. During the day, the room was just a room, cold, damp, smelling of rust and salt. No warmth, no presence, no sense of habitation. It was the absence of those things that I was going to experience, because the absence had become its own kind of information. The daytime lantern room was proof that the nighttime lantern room was different. It was my control group. It was the version of the room that confirmed the other version was real. I was going twice a week during the day and twice a week at night. 4 visits a week. I was careful to never miss a call with Sophie. I was careful to maintain my work schedule. I was careful to eat normally, sleep at reasonable hours, keep my apartment clean. I was, from the outside, completely fine. Greg Fialho never noticed anything. My sister never noticed anything. Dan never noticed anything. Dr. Kessler noticed that I seemed more centered, which was the worst thing she could have said, because it confirmed that the light was having a positive effect on my observable behavior, which made it harder to categorize as a problem. I was more centered. I was calmer. The chronic low-grade anxiety that had been the background frequency of my life since the divorce, the constant sense of being slightly behind, slightly insufficient, slightly wrong in every room I entered, was quieter. The light didn't fix it. The light didn't do anything to it. The light was just on, and being in the light was enough. And the enoughness carried forward into the daytime hours, like a slow-release medication. Is that predatory? I still don't know. I ask myself this constantly. Is a thing that makes you feel better predatory if it does so without your understanding and without asking anything in return? What if the only cost is your time? What if the only risk is that you need more of it? What is the difference between a coping mechanism and a dependency? And does the distinction matter if the dependency is working? October. The reports kept coming. Patrice forwarded them to me by habit. Now she'd added me to her distribution list for Barton Point complaints. In October, there were 6. One of them was from a New Bedford harbor master who'd seen the light from his office window 4 miles across the bay. He'd assumed it was a new navigation aid he hadn't been briefed on and had called the Coast Guard, who had called the town, who had forwarded it to Patrice, who had forwarded it to me. 4 miles. The light was visible from 4 miles away. When I'd first seen it from the turnout, 50 yards from the tower, it had been modest, visible, warm, but contained. It would not have been visible from 4 miles. Not that light, not that luminosity. It was getting brighter. On October 19th, I did something I hadn't done before. I brought someone with me. Her name was Lena Souza. She was a structural engineer. The state sometimes contracted for bridge assessments, and I'd worked with her twice before on unrelated projects. She was precise, skeptical, and had no patience for ambiguity. She was the most rational person I knew. I told her I needed a second opinion on a site assessment, an anomalous light source in a decommissioned tower, and asked if she'd come out one evening. She said yes with the cheerful bluntness of someone who doesn't overthink requests. We drove down together. I parked in the turnout. The light was on. Lena saw it immediately. "That's the decommissioned tower?" she said. "Yes. Someone's running a generator." "There's no generator." "A battery bank then, solar charged. It's not complicated." "There's no battery. There's no electrical infrastructure of any kind. I've inspected the tower twice." She looked at me, then back at the tower. "Let's go look." We climbed together. I watched her face on the stairs. I watched the moment the air changed, and she noticed it. Her nostrils flared slightly, the way they did when she was assessing a material she hadn't expected. She didn't say anything about it. In the lantern room, she stood very still for about 30 seconds. She looked at the light. She looked at the walls. She looked at the floor. She looked at the ceiling. She moved her hand in front of her face and noted the absence of shadow. "Okay," she said. "What am I looking at?" "I don't know." "This isn't a light source. A light source has a point of origin. This is..." She paused. She turned in a slow circle. "This is a medium. The air itself is luminous. That's not possible." "I know." "No, I mean..." She stopped again. She was looking at her own hands. The light was on them. It was on her face. It was warm. She could feel the warmth. I could see it in the way her shoulders dropped slightly. The way people's shoulders drop when they step into a warm bath. I mean, this is not something that has an engineering explanation. This is not a question of finding the source. There is no source. I know. She looked at me. "How long have you known about this?" "Since June." "And you haven't reported it?" "What form would I use?" She almost laughed. Then she didn't. She looked around the room again, and I watched something happen in her face that I recognized because it had happened in mine the moment when the analytical framework gives way, and the thing underneath it becomes visible, which is not the light, but the warmth. Not the warmth, but the welcome. Not the welcome, but the suddenly unbearable recognition that something in this room is aware that you are here and is not indifferent to your presence. "We should go," she said. We went. On the drive back, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm going to think about this. I'll call you." She called me 3 days later. "I'm not going back," she said. "And I'd recommend you don't either." "Can you tell me why?" Long pause. "Because I've been thinking about it constantly since we left. And that doesn't happen to me. I assess structures, I write reports. I move on. I don't think about the sites after I leave them. I'm thinking about this one." "What specifically are you thinking about?" "The warmth," she said. "I'm thinking about how warm it was. And I'm thinking about how I felt in there. And I don't want to talk about how I felt in there because it's not a structural assessment. It's not in my scope. I'm not equipped to evaluate what I felt in there." "Lena, don't go back, June. I mean it. Something in that room knows you're there. I could feel it. You could feel it. And the fact that it feels good, is the part that should scare you." I thanked her. I told her I'd think about it. I thought about it. I went back 3 nights later. November. I was in the lantern room on a cold night when I noticed something new. Not in the room outside it. I was looking through the east-facing window, out at the bay, and I could see lights on the water. Not running lights, not the ordinary navigation signals of fishing boats. Small, warm, amber lights, the same color as the lantern room. 3 of them, low on the water, not moving, steady, patient. I watched them for 40 minutes. They did not move. They did not blink. When I left the tower and drove away and looked back from the access road, they were gone. The lantern room was dark. The bay was dark. Everything was dark. The next night I went back, and they were there again. 4 this time, same amber tone, same steadiness. Same low position on the water, as though they were resting on the surface. The night after that, 6. I took out the spreadsheet Patrice had sent me. I started cross-referencing the 61 reports against the dates. I noticed something I'd missed before. The reports didn't just increase in frequency, they increased in plurality. The early reports always described one light, the lantern room. The later reports, starting in 2016 or so, occasionally mentioned lights, plural. Saw lights at Barton Point. Multiple lights near the lighthouse. Nobody had followed up because the singular version of the complaint was already unsolvable, and the plural version sounded even less credible, so it got filed the same way: nuisance. No action required. But there were more lights now. The lighthouse was not alone. Whatever it was, whatever the light was, whatever it was doing, whatever it was for, it was not a singular phenomenon. It was a process. It was ongoing. It was growing. The lighthouse was the first, or the largest, or the oldest, but it was not the only one. The amber lights on the water were the same thing, and they were multiplying, and their multiplication tracked the same patient curve as the reports. Slow, incremental, persistent, not rushing, not hiding, just becoming. I called Patrice. I asked her, as casually as I could, whether anyone had ever reported lights on the water near Barton Point. She was quiet for a moment. "How many are you seeing?" she said. The question hit me like a door opening into a room I hadn't known was there. Not, "What are you talking about?" but "How many?" She knew. She'd always known. The reports in her file were not mysteries to her. They were metrics. She was tracking it. "Patrice, I've lived in Westport my whole life," she said. "My father fished out of New Bedford. He saw the light in 1971. He told me about it when I was 12, and I didn't believe him, and then I saw it myself in 1988, and I've been watching ever since." "Watching what?" "The count. It used to be just the tower. Now it's—" She stopped. "How many did you see?" 6, last night. I saw 9 from my porch last Wednesday. 9. "Patrice, what are they?" "I don't know. Nobody knows. But they're spreading. They're slow, June. They're so slow. 1 every few years, maybe. But they don't go away. They don't go out. Once a new one shows up, it stays. It comes back every night, same as the tower." "Where are they?" "On the water. In the bay. But last month," she stopped again. I could hear her breathing. "Last month I saw one on land. West of the point, back toward the road. It was in the field behind the Almeida farm, just sitting there, on the ground. Same light, same color, same feeling." "You went close to it?" "No. I saw it from my car. I didn't stop. I went home and I locked my doors, and I called my daughter in Providence, and I talked to her for an hour about nothing because I needed to hear a person." We were both quiet for a while. The phone line hummed between us. Then Patrice said something that I haven't been able to stop thinking about, something I hear in her voice every night when I'm trying to sleep. "They're not doing anything, June. That's what gets me. 35 years I've been watching, and they've never done anything. They're just on. They're just warm. They're just there. And every year there are more of them, and they're spreading out from the point, and nobody's doing anything about it because there's nothing to do anything about. A light is on. A light is warm. A light is on the water. And now a light is in a field. What do you report? What do you call? What form do you fill out? It's just light, June. It's just light." I went back to Barton Point 2 more times after that conversation. Both times the lantern room was the same, warm, full, patient, inhabited. Both times there were lights on the water. I counted 11 on the last visit, 11 steady amber points on the dark surface of the bay, and 2 more on the land, south of the access road, in the scrubby brush between the turnout and the tree line. Low, still, warm, the same color as the lantern room, the same as everything. I stopped going in December. Not because something dramatic happened. Not because the light changed or the room revealed its purpose, or something appeared in the warmth that finally showed me what I was standing in. I stopped because Sophie asked me during a phone call on December 3rd if I could come to her school Christmas concert, and I realized I had to check my internal calendar not against work obligations or financial constraints, but against my visit schedule. I was scheduling my daughter around a lighthouse. I was scheduling my daughter around a light. I called Dr. Kessler. I told her everything. She listened for a long time. She didn't interrupt. When I was done, she said, "I want you to stop going." "I know. I want you to stop going, and I want you to tell your supervisor." "I know." "Are you going to?" "I don't know." June, what you're describing, the warmth, the welcome, the sense of being expected, those are the textures of attachment. You formed an attachment to this place. And the fact that the place appears to be doing something impossible doesn't change the clinical picture. You are a person who has spent 3 years living alone in an apartment that feels empty, co-parenting a child you see 14 days a month, working a job that no one thanks you for. You were vulnerable to anything that made you feel less alone. And you found it. And now you need to let it go. She was right. I knew she was right. She's probably still right. But she's never been in the lantern room. I stopped going. December, January, February, 3 months. I went to Sophie's concert. I took her for a full week over Christmas. I filed my remaining assessment reports. I ate dinner at my sister's house in Vermont. I did normal things in normal light, and the normal light was thin and blue and cold and cast shadows everywhere. Shadows under my hands and under my chin and behind my furniture and in every corner of every room. Because normal light has a source, and a source means a direction, and a direction means that half of everything is always dark. I didn't go to Barton Point. But I drove past the turnoff on Route 6 3 times, on legitimate work trips, and each time I slowed down, and each time I didn't stop, and each time the not stopping felt like a small, precise act of violence against something I loved. In March, Patrice called me. She didn't say hello. She said, 23. What? 23. I can see 23 from my porch right now. It's the middle of the afternoon, June. They're on in the middle of the afternoon. I pulled over. They've always been nighttime only. Not anymore. I was quiet. They're in the bay. They're in the fields. There's one on Horseneck Road near the school. It's just sitting in the grass median. People are driving past it. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and there's an amber light in the median, and people are driving past it, and nobody's stopping. I called the police, and they said they'd send someone, and no one came. I called them again, and they said they'd already checked it out, and there was nothing there, but I can see it. June, I'm looking at it right now. Patrice, I don't think other people can see them. Not all of them. I think you have to have been close to the first one. I think you have to have been in the room. I've been in the room, June. I went once in 1994, one time, and I've been seeing them ever since. And there are more every year, and now they're visible in daylight. And I don't know what they are, and I don't know what they want, and I don't know what's going to happen when there are enough of them. I didn't go to Barton Point. I went home. I sat in my apartment. The fluorescent light in the bathroom buzzed. The refrigerator hummed. The evening light through the west window was blue and thin and made of sunlight bouncing off the building across the street. And at 8:47 p.m., I looked out my kitchen window, and there was an amber light in the parking lot behind my building. Not a street light, not a headlight, not a reflection. A point of warm, steady, amber light about 2 feet off the ground in the empty space between the dumpster and the chain-link fence. It was the same color as the lantern room, the same color as the lights on the water, the same color as every light I had seen since June. It was small, it was patient, it was warm, it was here. I closed the blinds. I sat on my couch. I called Sophie. She was getting ready for bed, and Dan let me talk to her for 10 minutes, and she told me about a project she was doing on tide pools. And she asked me if I knew that Starfish could grow back their arms, and I said, "Yes, baby, I know. Isn't that amazing?" And she said goodnight, and I said goodnight, and I hung up, and I sat in my apartment in the dark. The light from the parking lot came in through the edges of the blinds. It was warm. It was the only warm thing in the room. It's been 2 months since that night. The light is still there every night, and now every afternoon, and now in the mornings. It's in the parking lot, and it's on the sidewalk outside my building, and last week I saw one in the hallway of the second floor, between the elevator and the stairwell. A small amber glow hovering at waist height, warm, patient, barely brighter than a candle, but unmistakable if you've been in the room. Nobody else reacts to them. I've watched. The woman in 2C walks past the hallway light every morning and doesn't turn her head. The maintenance guy mows around the one in the parking lot without deviating his pattern. They don't see them. Patrice was right. You have to have been in the room. I see 27 from my kitchen window now. I see them on the roofs of buildings and in the branches of trees and on the hoods of parked cars. I see them in the grocery store, hovering over the produce aisle. I see one in the lobby of Dr. Kessler's office, by the coat rack, and one in the waiting room of Sophie's school, and one on the dashboard of Dan's car when he drops her off for my weekends. They don't do anything. That's the thing Patrice said, that I can't escape. They don't do anything. They're just on. They're just warm. They're spreading across the landscape of my life in a slow, patient, geological expansion, and they are so gentle and so steady and so warm that I cannot make myself afraid of them, even though I know that this is not how light works, and this is not what light does, and whatever they are not light, and whatever they want, the warmth is not a gift. But I'm writing this in my kitchen at 11 p.m., and there are 4 of them visible through the window, and the apartment is warm for the first time since I moved in, and the shadows in the corners are softer than they used to be. And Sophie is asleep in Cranston, and I will call her tomorrow at 7:30, and I will not miss the call, and I will not go to Barton Point, and I am making the right choices. I am making every right choice. And the lights are still spreading, and the warmth is still growing, and I'm starting to wonder, this is the part I can't say to Dr. Kessler. This is the part I can't put on any form. I'm starting to wonder whether the light in the lantern room was ever waiting for me at all, or whether I was just the first one who sat with it long enough for it to learn how to leave, and whether the 27 lights I can see from my window are the same light, or its children, or something it made from the shape of my loneliness, and whether the warmth I feel is the warmth of being loved or the warmth of something learning to wear. The feeling of love, the way a lamp wears a shade, not to dim itself, but to make itself bearable enough that you won't look away while it arrives, and arrives, and arrives. I haven't gone back to Barton Point. I don't need to. The lantern room is everywhere now, and the light is so warm. And it doesn't do anything, and there are more every day.